It is really good to be here this morning. I live in Tauranga, so I left at 6:30 this morning. It's a terrible, terrible town to live in. If you want to fly anywhere, you've always got to go via something else. But it is really cool to be. I love Nelson. I part-time work with NZCMS. I also lead a brand new congregation in Te Puke. So that's another story in itself, but we planted this new congregation, 50, 60 people, about 7 weeks ago. So really, really enjoying that. Church planting in the Anglican Church. It's a beautiful thing. So I want you to imagine it's a Saturday morning and you're going to the butcher's and you're really excited about this because you're thinking about the meal that you're going to cook in the evening, and you've been thinking, what kind of meat would you like to cook? And it's, let's pretend that you're thinking that you'd like to buy a sirloin steak, 4 sirloin steaks that have been aged for 28 days. And they are Aberdeen, no, they're not, they're New Zealand beef. And maybe some Cumberland sausage in a nice coil, which is very difficult to find. And so you go down to the butcher's. It's a proper butcher shop. He's dressed in the right outfit. You're very excited. It's all free-range meat, high quality. The guy's been a butcher for 30 years. And so your expectations are high. And you go in there, you say, hi, yeah, I'd like some sirloin steak, aged 28 days. I'd like some Cumberland sausage. And he says, oh, of course, sir. He begins to kind of prepare it. And you're quite excited. You're thinking this, all the meat looks really beautiful. And you're looking along the counter, all kinds of lovely delicacies. And he wraps it in beautiful paper and wraps it in string. It's kind of romantic. And then he says afterwards, can I interest you in anything else, sir? And you say, nah, I think I'm done, thanks. And he says, are you sure? Because I've got the latest iPhone 17. Would you be interested in the latest iPhone? And I'm like, really? What do you mean? And he says, well, it's just come in. It's absolutely, it's amazing, amazing camera. The chip, it's superb. It's like, it beats anything that's been before it. Check it out. And he parts some raw chicken breast and a few pork chops. And sure enough, in the middle of all this raw meat is an iPhone on a little plinth, all shiny and smiling at me. And he says, a special deal on at the moment, sir. If you buy this plus the meat, you'll get a 20% discount on the Apple Watch. What do you think? You interested? Like if that happened to you, what would you think? How would you feel? A bit confused? You'd be like, what is with this guy? I've come for meat. I have not come for an iPhone. I would be very English about it, and I would go, thank you very much. I'll think about it, which generally means in the English mind, no, I won't. I'll think about it. I'll come back, and I will never go back to that butcher's ever again. Because he's a confused butcher, isn't he? He's confused. He's confused about the business that he's in. And I'm like, what's your focus? Is it the phone or is it the meat? I don't know if your meat's going to be the top quality after all. And I wouldn't go back there again. Now, why have I told you that? So I think one of the things when we think about missions is really to answer the question first, what is the church? What is the church about? What is the church for? Do we know? Are we able to articulate what we are about? In terms of Jesus talking about his Father's business, we too are about our Father's business. But are you clear about what that business is? I wonder whether people come into our churches, obviously not here, but other churches, and come in wanting one thing, but kind of get sold something else. And get a little bit confused about what this church really is. And this is not what I thought it was. And they maybe never come back again. I fear this happens more than we would like to admit. Next slide. When I was 7 years old, I was going to a really nice, quaint evangelical church in England, in the Midlands, in a place called Malvern in Worcestershire. Worcestershire sauce? That's how you say it correctly. Yeah. And so we're going to this nice church. Everyone wore a suit. The ladies wear dresses. All the men have beards. Some of the ladies too. There's sandals. Everyone's wearing sandals. It's a very proper church with an organ and just nice. There's a table at the front of the church with a massive Bible open to John 3:16. It's a Bible so big that no human being can actually pick it up. It's quaint and cute and just nice. And there's hymns playing. And you turn up to church, and it's all very pensive and very contemplative. And the organ is playing, and you look kind of spiritual and thoughtful, and you go and sit down as the organ's playing. Have you been in a church like that? You know what I'm talking about? Well, one day, there was a gang in our town. It was a punk gang. And this punk gang was about 40 punks. They looked a bit like that. We're in the mid-'80s. I've given away my age. And they're led by a guy called Vince the Knife. And Vince the Knife is a martial arts expert, and he has knives hidden in his body in different places. And one day, they've been out all night at some club, and they get back, and Vince goes to bed. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. And he gets into his bed, and Jesus walks into his room. Full presence of Jesus just comes into Vince's room. And he falls off his bed, and he begins to repent. And he repents and weeps for about 2 hours, uncontrollably weeping and repenting. And at the end of that 2 hours, Vince gives his life to the Lord. Within about 2 to 3 weeks, Vince leads the rest of the gang to Christ. I always joke and say whether he used his knife or not, we don't know. But the whole gang become Christian. And they're super excited about their faith. And they're like, we should go to church. We should join a church. Can you see where this is going to go? And so one Sunday morning, these 40 punks, cigarettes hanging out of their mouths, stinking of booze from the night before, because they're on a journey of discipleship. They turn up at our quaint English church with organ and suits and beards. And it's an interesting moment of different English cultures clashing in that moment. And it's all, you can imagine it. They turn up, they're very excited about their faith. It's very quiet with organ, and they pile in and they're like, hey, yeah, we've come to church. We love Jesus. We found Jesus. Yeah, whoa, Jesus, yeah. High-fiving the pastor at the door. And the English are interesting in a crisis because in a crisis you want to be with an English person because they keep their cool. And so in the midst of this, all these punks piling into this church, it doubled the church instantly. All these people are sitting quietly like this. Just don't even break it. Don't even break a facial expression. Inside they're going, please Jesus, take me now, it's Armageddon. But externally they're as cool. It's James Bond on the external. These punks have never been in church before. They're completely unchurched. They're putting their feet up on the pews. They're asking questions, cracking jokes, going back and forth to the doors to have a smoke in and out of the service, asking the pastor questions during the talk. What do you mean the blood of the lamb? What's that got to do with anything? At the end of the service, they make fun of the cheap biscuits, steal some Bibles and leave. And the whole church collectively sighs and says, thank God they've gone. Next Sunday, they turn up again. And the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday. And they want to get involved, want to help serve. So one guy has a gift of hospitality, and so he wants to serve cups of tea with the old lady that serves tea. And they have this moment where both of them have blue hair. And they're kind of judging each other. Another guy who's really quite relational decides he wants to welcome people on the door with the pastor, with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and high-fiving old ladies at the door. After a few months, this goes on. The church, there's people threatening to leave because it's disruptive, isn't it? And they have a secret meeting. They don't invite the punks. They have a secret meeting, and they basically have this discussion, and they decide they need to ask the punks to leave. They're like, we're really happy that you've become Christians, but could you please go and be Christian somewhere else? Confused about the family business, perhaps. My mum and dad are in that meeting. They're about 30 years old. And I don't know why. My dad was a policeman. My mum was a nurse. And they kind of open their mouths and they're like, this feels wrong. Why are we asking them to leave? Surely this is what church is for. We should make this work. It's messy, but we should make it work. And an argument breaks out. And in the end, the pastor says, if you feel so strongly about it, why don't you go with them? Why don't you become their pastor? You go with them. My parents are like, we're not trained. We don't know anything. And the pastor says, we're going to ask them to leave anyway. So go with them or don't go with them. Pray about it. So another couple with my parents were missionaries in Thailand. And they were like, we think we know what we could do. We could have a go. We could muddle through it. It's a great approach to church, isn't it? We could work it out as we go. And so they just feel like God's challenging them to go with the punks. So overnight, I think they couldn't rent anywhere, because who wants to rent a building to 40 punks that are confessing Christians? In the end, they used someone's garage, a double garage, and borrowed some couches and started a church. And I was 7 years old, and I guess my normal became a different type of normal. I thought it was pretty cool at 7. You know, all my role models suddenly were quite interesting. The church trebled within about 6 months because the good news went out. The good news went out that said, basically, there is a community that will welcome you and love you just how you are. And it's a place where you can belong. And so more punks came, homeless people, drug addicts, hippies from the 70s, all kinds of degenerates that felt like they didn't belong joined our church. My poor parents, it was pretty chaotic. The punks didn't like anything about church. They didn't like the songs we sang. They didn't like how we did anything. And my parents were like, well, what is important? What should we do? What do we keep behind? And they had to explore what are the non-negotiables of church. But I won't get stuck in that. It's an interesting story. For me, growing up in that environment was a privilege. It was messy, but I guess it was a community of grace. Because every week they kept doing something wrong. They were falling over, getting pregnant, falling back into drugs, going in and out of prison. It was complicated, and discipleship took a while. But we had to offer grace and kindness, mercy. And I guess that's the normal Christian practice, isn't it? So a bit of a 101, next slide, really quickly, as this is not a lecture on missions. I guess some helpful scriptures for us to think about. What is missions? Because in order to understand missions, it's all wrapped up in what is the church. Because really, we're exploring this topic, the Missio Dei, the missional heart of God, the God who is missional, who has sent his own son into the world to change life and to create a new way of being. So right back in Genesis 12, quick 101, the call of Abram. It's a pretty cool calling. He's in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is kind of Babylon, Iraq today. And God calls him and says, I want you to follow me into the desert. I'm going to make you into a new people. I'm going to create a people around you. I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to teach you a new way of living. And I'm going to multiply you. And your people are going to bless every single nation and every family of the earth. This is like the first missional kind of foundational piece. I'm not sure we teach on it enough, but it's called the Abrahamic covenant. And Abraham, he must have thought, what do you mean? He lived in a 2-story house. He had servants, and God's like, give it all up, go into the desert, follow me. And he might have gone, where are we going to go? Well, just trust me. How long is it going to take? Trust me. Can I have a map? Trust me. Vaguely just follow that river and we'll see how it goes. And it took a long time. But this was the missional calling. But really, the point of it being is that God wanted to bless all families of the earth through his seed. The greatest commandment. One day someone asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, strength, mind, body. Love God with your whole life and love your neighbor as yourself. I guess this is the next building block in thinking about missions. We're called to be a blessing to all peoples, no matter where they've come from. And we're also called to love God with our whole life, radically, and then to love our neighbor as ourselves. Not just your physical neighbor, but really anyone that you meet. Then finally, just as Jesus is leaving the earth, he leaves his disciples with the Great Commission. And he says, therefore go. There was an assumption that they were going to go anyway. Make disciples of all nations. Teach them everything I have commanded you. To create communities and disciple people and teach them Jesus' way. Make disciples of all peoples. Keep going, keep expanding out from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Judea, the ends of the earth. You will be my witnesses, but make disciples. And then finally, I guess what we're aiming for, Revelation 7:9, we have this vision of all ethnic people groups streaming to the mountain of God, to worship in their own languages. And this is something that we look to with anticipation and excitement. But we're not there yet, and we live between these two spaces of being challenged to be a blessing, to love God, to love our neighbor, to make disciples until such a time comes as he returns. That was Greek 101. Is that all right? Are you with me? So this is a great revelation. And I guess I'm always thinking, well, what's the journey? What does that look like for the church, for me as an individual? And I came across this quite cool set of words. Next slide. It's from a book by Skye Jethani called Futureville. And in it, he says that the Garden of Eden creates the blueprint for the perfect life that God intended for humanity. You think about it, God creates a garden in the midst of a desert, and all of the components for a flourishing human life are in that place. And these words summarize those things. It was a beautiful garden. God said that there was trees there that were for food, but also for beauty. And human beings need beauty to flourish. It was a place of abundance. They had food, they lacked nothing. But it was also a place of order. It was bounded, if you like. It was a garden. It had clear boundaries, and it was covered by God's presence, his justice, his righteousness, his peace. And I find these words really helpful to think about missions, to think about the role of the church, because these are blueprint words, and they're kind of missional, God's missional heart words. They define what we are all called to bring more beauty into the world, to bring order, peace, justice, righteousness, but to also bring provision. And you might be an artist. That fits. You might be involved in government and governance areas, health and all that kind of area. You might be a businessman or in farming. But all of these words suddenly become quite missional in the way that we come together and bring God's kind of beautiful kingdom into fruition. The opposite of these words describe, I guess, the darkness of the world, or where the devil is active. So what would be the opposite of beauty? Opposite of beauty? Ugliness. Opposite of order? Chaos. Opposite of abundance? Scarcity, poverty. And so wherever you see ugliness and chaos and scarcity, there is the kingdom of darkness. And those are the places that we're called to. And they can be just over the street. But I think I want to leave those with you. They're really helpful ways of thinking. Next slide. I guess that the missional life that we are all called to as the church is about seeing differently. And I'm constantly pondering this, that we are, as we're discipled, as we follow Jesus, our mind is being renewed, but our worldview is being renewed, and the way that we are looking at everything changes, and we begin to interpret through a biblical lens, and we think differently. So we look differently and we think differently. We don't allow our circumstances to be dictated by the world or by darkness, but we are a people that can see and interpret color. We can interpret through this kind of Great Commission lens, if you like. But it takes creativity. John Taylor, a famous CMS dude, said that mission is the adventure of the imagination. And I love this. I think that's a great way of thinking about mission for us as a church, not just overseas, but right here, right now. It is an adventure of the imagination. And as we think about these biblical 101 mission kind of foundations, they are applicable here in Nelson over the street. But they keep on being applicable as we expand out into the world, Jerusalem, Judea, the ends of the earth. So what we practice here missionally has the same kind of application as Uganda or Syria or wherever God has called us. So missions is our lifestyle, and really the context is the real thing that we ask God about. Where is that? Where should I be placed? Next slide. I guess this is Syria last year, and an adventure of the imagination might be, if you were living there, what would you do? How would you live? How would you bring God's kingdom, his good created order, into a place like that? Would you be in there and go, gosh, it's just terrible, it's dark, it's degradation. Can anything happen here? Can anything change? And I guess as humans, we can slip into those modes of thought. But as God's people, we're not called to think like that, or to look and see like that, or interpret what can be, because we're people of faith. And I guess if you were living there, the challenge would be to put on different spectacles and to look through a missional lens, a Jesus-shaped lens. What could this look like? And I don't mean just tidying it up, but what would the kingdom of God look like there if a bunch of Christians moved there and began to practice a Jesus-centric life? And really, this is a metaphor for people's hearts and all kinds of situations that we find throughout New Zealand and throughout the world. Everyone is living in some degree of this, whether it is internally or externally. Here's a couple of stories for you. I guess this describes, and we'll unpack this more tonight, this is what drove Mike to go into Moments and to go into Uganda, what continually inspires Mike for his contextual calling to be a missionary, to be a blessing, to make disciples, to bring joy, to bring the kingdom of God, to bring new pathways. And I want to suggest to you, it's not just for Mike. That's not just an elite calling. It is the calling of the Christian, of the follower of Jesus. And it is about the context that we find ourselves. Quick story for you. Next slide. I don't know where I'm at. So it's applicable in New Zealand. I was working with a team that had just got back from Ethiopia, a bunch of 20-year-olds. I worked with YWAM, if you know YWAM, for about 28 years. YWAM into the Anglican space ordination. Very strange cocktail. But this was a YWAM team that had gone to Ethiopia. God called them to go there to Addis Ababa. And they went there, but they had no context. They didn't know what they were going to do. But they'd been formed in this missional 101 thinking. So they turned up, and the classic kind of first question was, God, why are we here? What do you want us to do? And so they sought God's voice. Lord, what do you want us to do? I think that's a great principle in missions. Here I am, Lord. I put on these spectacles to look through it in a different way. But what would you like me to do? Where should I go? And how do you want me to outwork this calling? They prayed for a bit, and they felt God saying, I want you to go and make camp at the rubbish dump. Now, in Ethiopia, a rubbish dump is about possibly the size of Nelson, and it's piles of rotting refuse and dead things and horrible rotting decay, food, homeless, wild dogs. You can imagine, stinks like nothing else. And so they went there and they were like, wow, okay, how do we be missionaries here? And they walked around with their eyes open, and they came across a bunch of children living on the dump. They were orphans, and they befriended these orphans and began to hang out with them. And they were like, well, how do we be Jesus to these kids? Should we start a Bible study? What do we do? But they realized that the first point of call in thinking about abundance and order and beauty was to bring those things into their very kind of life, their daily life. And they were like, how could we change the way that these kids are living? Because they were begging, they were trying to find things to sell. And they were like, what gifts do we have amongst us? And one of the guys is like, he's an artist, and he's like, I know how to make t-shirts. What do you think to that? What if we made t-shirts? And everyone kind of made fun of him and said, well, that's not helpful on a rubbish dump in Ethiopia. And he said, well, what if we got the kids making art and we taught the kids how to make t-shirts? Maybe they could start a t-shirt business. And everyone was like, oh, that's different. And so they went on this journey of making some t-shirt printing frames out of old wood they found in the dump, kind of getting some art materials together, teaching the kids how to make art. The kids would design pieces of art that reflected their life on the rubbish dump. And through this journey over months, they created a business and began to sell these t-shirts, and it started to make money. And they were sending stuff back to Germany where they'd come from. And it generated more and more income. They rented a garage where they could do printing, and the kids lived above it. And at the end of about 3 months, these young Germans, or a mixture of Germans and Americans, decided that they needed to stay. And they were like, we've started something, we need to stay. We didn't expect this, but we've been taken over. A bit like my parents with the punk church, their life direction changed through t-shirt printing on a rubbish dump. And they stayed. And this thing grew into a school, kids became Christians, It generated all kinds of housing and adoption principles. And a few years later, I heard that the first child that had come through this process had just graduated from university. And you realize that our lives can make a difference, even with limited skill set, by listening to God and being obedient to what he asks us to do. We can actually really make a difference. And I think that's what Jesus asked us to do. During COVID, my wife and I had that same challenge. We were in England, and it was a horrible lockdown. And we were like, what do we do, Lord? How do you want us to be missional in a lockdown? How can we be a blessing, beauty, order, and abundance? And we heard via the grapevine that the local brothel, I guess, is the best way, but the whole community of street workers in the town next to us were in a lot of trouble, because if you're a street worker during a lockdown, you're not making a lot of money. And no one really thought about that during lockdown. And we were like, and if you're not making money, you've got no money for food. And the government aren't handing out those kind of, will replace your income if you're a prostitute. So they had no money, and they had no money to feed their kids. And so we prayed, kind of brainstormed a bit, and started a kind of a food production line in little boxes, like a lot of people did during COVID. But we delivered these food boxes to street workers all the way through COVID. We fundraised for it, and we weren't even allowed to meet other people. So we fundraised, we did the cooking, we did cooking in shifts. It got delivered in a kind of covert, kind of in a box on a street, and someone else came and picked it up. And we fed these street workers all the way through COVID. And I don't know whether any of them became Christians. I don't think they probably did. But we were God's light and salt in that place. And I think that's, again, the great challenge. We eventually got a letter from the mayor, a commendation for the mayor for feeding street workers during COVID. God opens up all kinds of complex, beautiful doors when we are radically obedient just to the small things over the street. But as you experience those things over the street, so your world broadens and widens. And so God will call you into new places. And that's what we're about. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.